Why does the pursuit of happiness sometimes cause dissatisfaction rather than reduce it?
Well, there's a couple things inside that. One is that we often define happiness as an absence of pain, of difficult thoughts, feelings, memories, bodily sensations. And so the pursuit of happiness can lead to the pursuit of eliminating the things that your mind tells you that our normal way of thinking tells us need to go away in order to be happy. There's that. And then there's the second thing, which is we tend to want any kind of emotion, if we evaluate it as positive, to stay. And those two things, we call them in the work that I do experiential avoidance, pushing away your experiences, and experiential attachment, clinging to your experiences, are together probably the most toxic things you can do in life. If you had to pick a way to suffer and to be rigid and to have a difficult life, those two, and of the two, avoiding is the one that is mostly inside mental health disorders, so called, and all of that. But interestingly, the attachment part, which is, I think, especially inside sometimes people who are very privileged and have lots of things and so forth, is talked about a lot less. But it's equally, once you measure it, uh, equally toxic. It turns out that hanging on to happiness is not a happy thing, and avoiding sadness or the pain that life brings amplifies that pain for reasons that we can get into. Um, I can give you an easy example of each if you wanted an example.
Yep, let's do it.
Well, you're talking to a person who's a panic disorder person in recovery, in quotes, scare quotes, panic disorder. All that disorder language is not very close to what's really happening. And at the height of that struggle, anxiety would be something to be anxious about. And so I'm looking for, is it coming? Is it getting higher? Oh, if it gets really high, I won't be able to function. Maybe the same thing will happen as last time. It'll be so embarrassing. This would be a disaster. I'm on a call with this really important person. I'm going to bring it right to this moment. We're having a conversation. It will be broadcast. It will, well,
So this is like a trying to control the situation rather than accepting what happens to be
yeah,
the
well,
case.
not controlling the situation is one thing. With through behavior, we can control our situations. Trying to control our emotions, which is an echo of the past and the present and is there for a reason, um, if it's backed up by cognitive threats and so forth, well, the natural response to, oh, if this will happen, that would be really bad. I mean, if I told you a terrorist is going to bust on your door in the next 30 seconds, and that's very credible, and he has a machine gun, and very likely, I'm sorry, he's going to shoot you, you will be very anxious. Well, if I had you wired up to a polygraph, an old classic metaphor we use in the therapy work I do, and I said, your job is just to be relaxed, but if you get nervous, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to shoot you. And the same thing would happen to you is you're going to be, oh, oh, because you have a polygraph in your own nervous system. So if you set up a situation where anxiety is something to be anxious about, you're going to be anxious. Hello. Because you're going to watch for it. And as soon as you're watching for it and it's cognitively linked to something that would lead to anxiety, there's going to be a little incremental. You'll notice that. And then you'll say, oh, let's see it's coming. You'll notice that. And on the attachment part, if I were to say to you something like, that feeling of relaxation that you have here is so wonderful. Let's just make it continue forever. However, there's this very challenging thing that's coming up that you have to do, and you haven't prepared for it. But we want them to have it forever. We want to feel relaxed, just like you do at the side of the beach. And uh, well, you're going to notice that it's slipping away. Most people don't feel like you're at the side of the beach when you're about to do something very challenging. Why would you? Your body needs to mobilize for that. And the sensations that come with that aren't in the category you have of so relaxed and on the beach. So be careful. If by happiness you mean living a values based life, eudaimonia, yes, you can have that in a pretty much continuous state, but it's not an emotion. It's the word happiness, but it's not an emotion. It's a flow of being connected to meaning and purpose moment by moment in your life. And that can happen when you're weeping at the death of somebody close to you. You wouldn't say, I'm happy that somebody close to me died, but you could say, this, this is so precious. And losing this person close to me is something that is dear to my heart. And if somebody would say, "Oh, I can remove the tears over the death of your mother," you'd say, "What? What are you doing? What a crazy." No.
So
Well,
happiness in that sense that you described, eudaimonia, human flourishing is not necessarily absence of negative feelings, uh, but they are necessary part of the experience. Or
yeah. I mean, feelings are there to help orient you to the present moment, given your history. Your physical and in evolutionary time, we create through evolution sensation and perception systems that allow us to feel. And it's very, very critical that we do that. And your body is sensing that. If you, in mouse models, you take a single dose of opiates, your pain sensitivity goes up a significant percentage with one dose because your body's going like, oh, I'm not feeling as well. I think not feeling as well. That's the wrong way to say it. My sensation is not, and it'll adjust. Well, then here you got the opiate crisis. You chase, getting rid of pain, and you end up with a very pain sensitive body that needs constant dosing. And next thing you know, you're addicted and you've got constipation and you've got all the disasters that come, so feeling and, that's the sensation directly, but how about feeling, in these other senses like anxiety, sadness, etc. Yeah, they are historical and current. And take an example. A person has been abused sexually, let's say, uh, will feel the history of that when they even think about intimate relationships. Well, a common thing you may want to do if you want to get rid of that is you push it down. If you push it down enough, then you don't know when you're feeling nervous about that. You become alexithymic. You don't even have words for it because you've dampened down how your history can be in the present. And then you get this very sad thing. I'm always reluctant to say it because people say I'm blaming the victim of people who have been sexually abused. If they dampen down the emotional impact of that and don't walk through it, they're significantly more likely to be abused again because you can't read anymore. You're in the bar with somebody who's very attractive and interesting and fun. And why don't we go have a drink and come to my house? And your sixth sense will say, no, that doesn't feel safe. I'm not going to do that. Is not there.
oh, interesting. So clinging back to those emotions have that side effect that you may be likely to experience them again in the future.
You actually you're more likely, because of the self-amplifying side, if you're avoiding your emotions, but you're also putting yourself in a situation where you can no longer make situational reads as well. Reads, I'm in Reno, reading gamblers. This is the way of talking about your sensitivity to what's going on in the moment externally to you is being dampened down. So you become ignorant. And as my wife, I'm another shining star of emotional awareness. As my wife sometimes says to me, dear, I don't know can still be avoidance. What are you feeling? Oh, I don't know. That actually is gender type because males are not given the kind of emotional training. It starts in infancy. I mean, whether or not you're dressed in pink versus blue clothing predicts whether or not you'll be given the kind of training that allows you to know more about your own emotional life. Some men have to work harder to even acquire these skills later. But when you're able to notice, read, describe uh, what we call emotions, which is not a simple body thing, it's cognition, it's your body, it's your behavioral predispositions all coming together under a label, but being able to observe and describe then informs this moment and you're able to read. So that I think part of the problem in amplifying of creating kind of a miserable life uh, is that avoidance has this multiple impact. The clinging one is a little different. It has a little different of a quality. It has an avoidance piece in it, but uh, it's more, I think, because the behaviors that we engage in when we're trying to cling to emotions actually begin to narrow the possibilities in the situation in which emotions can occur. Emotions need to go up and down to serve their function. There's a signaling system. And we've spent so much time, Homo sapiens spent so much time learning how to describe them because it's so useful to these social primates called humans. It's a
So,
whole lot easier to say, are you hungry? Meaning, will you receive and eat food now, let's say, as opposed to how many minutes have you been food deprived? So if you're at a Thanksgiving dinner and it's another piece of pie, you say, yes, yes, I'm still hungry, even though your stomach is about to burst. Um, and parents complain to children when they get it wrong. You said you were hungry and you're not eating it. So you have to have that to regulate the people around you, that social function of emotion gets ripped off. And that happens with the attachment side as well. You start lying to others and yourself.
yeah, that famous Dostoevsky line that the most, I forgot how it was phrased, most despicable thing is to lie to yourself rather than to lie to other people. Uh, I have another question. So, thoughts, emotions. I mean, Rene Descartes once said, I think, therefore I am. Some philosophers interpret it as saying that there are only thoughts in the universe, nothing else. So, where do thoughts and emotions come from? Let's say I had a bad experience in the past. I think I moved on, but okay, all of a sudden I am going on my day, and okay, this pops up nowhere, as if some evil spirit is out there running behind my back and catching me.
Well, we need a model of thinking that really fits the human situation. Non human animals think, but they don't think in symbolic terms. Um, a symbol, the first part of that word means similar, and ball is to throw. The metaphor of a symbol is something that's thrown back as if it's the same. Reference to refer from a Latin word for ferrying, for carrying it back again. That's the great human invention. And that's an entire piece of my work called Relational Frame Theory, which is a usage-based model of cognition that unfortunately occurred in its early form 45 years ago. So the cognitive scientists who are realizing that usage-based models actually work wonderfully well because of AI and deep seeks and all these kinds of things. Those labs are finding this old literature very slowly, where we worked out many of these things 40, 45 years ago when usage-based models were a laughingstock. And Chomsky had killed Skinner, and it's impossible, it couldn't possibly be done that way. It must be in your head, some sort of Platonic insertion or some sort of modularity of the mind that had. It's not so. The core issue here of human cognition, and I need this because human thinking, the question you're asking, what thoughts even are learning a relationship in one direction, and we have to define what a relationship is. It isn't just association. That's one kind of relationship, but there's a learning in one direction and being able to derive it in the other direction without training on that specific set of relata. And then being able to combine those into a network, but also do it in a way that the functions of the relata can alter the functions of other parts of the network based on the underlying derived relations that exist within the network. So it's a lot of words, but I can make it very, very simple. I mean, if I were to say to a 12-month-old, this is a pen, let's say, pen, eventually when I hear, if you said pen appeared, even a 6-month-old baby, you can get that well, and you could with a collie or Pepper Brood's parrot, or and please don't email me about your cat or dog. I know the cat or dog is very smart, but no, the point where it breaks is that given training on that, like pen. Now I say pen, and the wobbly head is trying to find it around 16 months old in the research that I've done on others. It could be a little early, maybe 12 months, but it's in that range. And then that's learn it in one, derive it in two. It takes multiple exemplars, just like it would with usage-based models and then large language model. You can even model this with large language models, but in developmental work, we know quite a number of sets. It's not a huge number, probably 20, something 30. And at some point, you can do that. You then also start getting in new relations, like children hear an unfamiliar word, scan, they see the things that they can see that they already have a bidirectional name-object relation, what I just call frames of coordination, because I don't want to use languages of reference that pull in all of our lay language ideas about cognition. If you want to do a technical analysis, you want to be a little more careful about that. And the baby will derive. I hear something that looks through paired linguistic cues, probably is one of those ones that's bidirectional. And here's something over here. So I heard, let's say, metronome. And here's this strange thing over here. I will, through exclusion or frames of distinction, derive a mutual relation. And I did early research on this. One of the first demonstrations with my now 30, he just turned 38-year-old boy, the so-called Charlie studies I did in my lab, where we actually had a nursery and tracked this. The moment was so exciting, where he was able to derive a mutual relation between things with no training by us about this is called a metronome. Just as an example, hearing something unfamiliar, seeing something unfamiliar, and deriving a mutual relation. Now we're right at the language explosion zone where every parent has seen without any training. I never even taught him. Now he's doing that. Yeah, because he's listening.
So language is inseparable part of this whole process.
Language and cognition, really, human thought. Of course, human thought can be conditioned the way your dog or cat does. And that's very important, because this evolutionary recent adaptation, we know that chimpanzees don't do it. The so-called language-trained chimpanzees don't do what I just said. Neil Dugdale years ago, with Sue Savage and Dwayne Rumbaugh's chimps down in Atlanta. Some of the best, wonderful training and stuff. And Dwayne was a friend. We helped start the American it's like a psychological society, now the Association for Psychological Science, which I started. Well, that's another story. But Dwayne was a kind of a warrior with me on some of these science foundation kind of things we did. But when Neil took the pride of the troop, I forget her name, Lana, I think it was Lana, one of the chimps. When you trained it one direction, test it in the other direction in controlled circumstances, it was chance level responding.
Mm.
So what we're doing, what your baby is doing, breaks us away from all these millions of years of evolution. You still have in your thinking the earlier processes. You learn by habituation of things really early, and then by operant and classical conditioning. That's 500 million years old. How do we know that? Every organism since the Cambrian does it. Every single one. So if you're slime mold, you don't need to worry about it. Human cognition, rather operant and classical conditioning don't work, but
So
they
that
do.
explains, for example, if you're talking about non-human primates, since they don't possess language, and that's why we cannot expect them to come up with philosophy, science, and even if they are much more intelligent than human beings, let's imagine.
Intelligence is a different thing. I mean, their intelligence, they are, the story of evolution is the sort of story of consciousness and intelligence. I mean, some like 20 different evolutionary pathways have led to eyes, for example. And to be able to consciously organize your behavior with regard to your environment, be careful about reifying this. We'd be maybe living in the Matrix. We don't really know. I'm with Donald Hoffman on that. Evolution doesn't guarantee that the operating system is actually corresponding in a simple sense with the one world. You can call it the real world. I would fine, real world, but the one
Can we
world.
explore that a bit further? So, yeah, does evolution help us to survive in
Yes,
a model of the world rather than the external objective world? Is that
I
similar
think.
idea?
Well, I to the degree that you can test it, in my opinion, looking at it, correspondence is an unnecessary addition, because I'm a pragmatist and I'm thinking that what's true is what works, and that's what evolutionary knowledge is. I mean, and initially survival, yes, survival, but you can have other selection mechanisms, and we as humans have come up with it, like the selection power of our meaning making systems of values and things of that kind. And maybe we'll get into that discussion. But yeah, I think be careful about the overhang of assuming that knowledge corresponds with the world in any simple sense, when the only real filter is life and death early on, but also organization. That it isn't just life and death in a crude way. But back to the storyline, when you're asking about thinking and thoughts, that evolutionary, the evolutionary process that led to operant and classical conditioning is part of our thinking. And it shows up often in our intuitive sense, or our know-how, or, the things that we can do, our perceptual systems. If you have, this happens to people who have severe cataracts and things like that, and from birth, and then somebody, often in countries where they don't have medical care, and then it's removed, and initially the person can't see. They have to learn how to see, and uh, so there's even things that basic. Learning is part of it. But what we did as human beings is somehow, I think it's because we're social primates, developed a form of cooperation in which seeing and saying led to hearing and seeing. And, in many organisms, prairie dogs, a squeak, you run. You hear the squeak, you run for the hiding. No, you see the evil, you squeak. You hear the squeak, you run to the hidey hole. Those are separate systems. They're coordinated, but they're in different parts of the brain, you know, and the poor one that squeaked when they saw the eagle is more likely to be a victim of predation. There's some cost there. But multi-level selection, the good of the prairie dog troop, kept them both systems there. But what we're doing, and you can even see it in the underlying neurobiology because they show up in the same parts of the brain, is that we, you know, in our history have learned to see this, call it a pen, hear pen, and look for this, and then put it into networks that change what you do. Learn it in one, derive it in two, put it in networks that change what you do. That's a ditty that summarizes 40 years of my life. And that's the relational frame theory view. So a thought, back to your point, why does it show up? Especially when you don't want it, let's say. Well, okay, you're creating networks of derived relations that are interconnected. Many of these relations haven't been explored, and networks have many. In fact, the single most common relation is I don't know. Most common derived relation is a known relation of non-information, and which is an interesting things to explore. But when you do the math on this, let me say it this way, and then I'll come back. It's a little extended answer, but let me say it this way, and come back to like, why did you have that thought exactly? You're hoping that you wouldn't, and so forth. Your sensitivity to it. I've done the math on this. If you think of how many things you know about, where you can describe the attributes of that verb or noun, then you think of how many relations are possible. A relation is responding to one thing in terms of another. So I could say a causal relation, this caused it, or a comparative one, this is bigger or smaller or faster or prettier. I could say a kind of coordination, this goes with, a hierarchical, this is part of, this is, think of all those relational terms. And you can just do it with a dictionary, and there's many thousands. Now do
Endless
the
dictionary, yeah.
math. Now do the math on the simplest sentence. The simplest sentence would be this and all of its attributes that are implicit. You're not going to name them all. Any one thing. You could say probably 150 things about this. I don't know, quite a number. What's made of, what it does, blah, blah, blah.
So from just about thinking about the pen can even evoke some emotions that are associated. Maybe maybe 10 years ago, let's say like that pen caused some horrible
Yes. Exactly. Now let me just give you this punchline and then loop back to your question. I haven't lost the thread, thankfully. Take all of the things you know about, including verbs and so forth, and all of their attributes. The simplest sentence would be this something with its attributes is related in some way, shape, or form with this something with all of its attributes. That's the simplest sentence. Okay. How many potential sentences are in your head if I just take all the things that are in the dictionary and what a person, let's say, of your education, etc., is likely to know? You know, it approximates the number of molecules in the universe. So your cognitive space, you might as well say, is infinite. Because if a sentence could do that, how about a paragraph? How about a story? How about your entire life? Okay? Now, you're trying to regulate that because it has emotional impact. If this wasn't a pen, but was a pin, and you remember, ow, what happened? And it may go all the way back to, probably when you were barely verbal. Mama was putting on my, and she stuck me. Oh, so traumatic. Okay, that's now in your learning history. So how many things could evoke or elicit that thought that you don't want? Now add to that the thought that you don't want that thought. You just created a neurobiological groove from this nearly infinite network between all of the situations that could occur that would lead to the thought that you didn't want this, that could be subterranean. You don't need to be conscious of it. It's happening in your dreams. Once this thing gets going, it has a life of its own. It it just is interacting constantly. It's part of your underlying neurobiology. And that can connect you. It's even more likely to connect you to the thing that you don't want. Oh, I
Mm.
hope I don't. Dude, you just did. If I say, I'm going to give you a sentence, Masood. Don't think of, I can't tell you. As soon as I tell you, you're doomed.
I'm thinking already about it if you tell me. Yeah.
Yeah, even don't think of. I bet you start scanning the things you don't want to think of.
I'm like, what you gonna
Oh,
say?
I
Yeah.
haven't seen that one.
Maybe that's the you want to say plan something in my mind, then that would lead to the next question.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and good communicators or manipulators or stuff, they're good at that. They're actually, sometimes you get moved by people who know how to dance that dance verbally in ways that make it more likely, negotiators and con men and all that kind of stuff. That there's a science of it even. And we can, some of the work on implicit cognition and so forth. I mean, it's very difficult. And over in relational frame theory, we have several methods that I think are pretty good. I mean, back in the day when they were putting Obamacare out there in Nevada, asked me to vet all the advertisements they were using, and we did it using some methods that we've derived that sort of tapped into what are the little things that would show up if you had a picture of a doctor in a coat versus because we wanted people to enroll in the healthcare system if they didn't have healthcare before. And we were able to give them some good things like don't call it a federal system. Don't say only Nevada. Don't say U.S. Don't say federal. Don't say, you know, so we can do what good advertisers do. It's a little scary, I think, what's happening here with AI and stuff, because people are stumbling onto the things that I, I think really, really, really are going on in our consciousness all the time. Not because the modeling is the same. I don't think we have a large language model in the simple associative way inside our head. It's a little different than that. But uh, what's happening just in the AI systems, to the degree that we understand them, now that we turn them loose and stop trying to make them fit our models, but allowed them just to do what they do and then try to understand them, we're seeing things that are echoes of the kinds of things that I'm talking about in this 40-year research program. And the big usage-based labs like Josh Tenenbaum at MIT and people like that have become interested in relational frame theory and so forth, just to see, can we help understand some of what's going on that way. So, but back to their practical question, what is thought? Human thought is all of these forms of learning and consciousness combined and dominated by derived relational responding. That's our technical term. And it's controlled by such subtle stimuli and so forth that it's very difficult to manage, thus mindfulness training, things like that. And there's no really good delete button in your nervous system. So once in, short of brain injury or deterioration or whatever, if you've ever learned anything and it's part of the network, you may have forgotten it, but you'll acquire it again more easily because it's still in your underlying neurobiology. Very, very likely. So we're historical beings. How are you going
I,
to manage your own emotions, thoughts, etc., in a way if you have an infinite space in principle, and yet you keep falling into these kind of ruts that prevent you from learning new things? I think one of the ruts is you're trying to manage that infinite space with methods that produce what you're trying to avoid.
Hope you're finding this conversation interesting, and if so, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the show reach more people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episode. Now back to the conversation. I think I have accidentally discovered the effectiveness of this method in my own life. I think it's called acceptance and commitment therapy. Yeah, I don't have a much practical experience with the therapy, but yeah, one thing is trying to manage your anxiety. The next another way is just letting them be and you going on with your life. So let's say I'm going to give a talk and I'm anxious. Instead of controlling it, I can just say, okay, anxiety, yeah, whatever, let it be there in the background. I'm just gonna go and give my talk anyway. So I found this really helpful. I think I discovered it accidentally, even way before I had any idea about ACT.
Yeah, please call it ACT, because ACT always sounds to me like ECT, and I'm old enough to have seen a lot of those sessions. But yeah, we took this model of language and cognition I'm talking about and co-evolved. I was started all the way back in 1981, so it's 45 years old. It was pretty much invisible to the world for the first 20 years because I wanted to work out not just that it worked. I did 4 quick randomized trials with acceptance and commitment therapy, or acceptance and commitment training if you're outside of a therapy context. It's the same thing. And finally decided to step forward when I thought I understood the process, I could measure it, and I'd worked on my philosophy of science enough that we could walk into the lion's den of meaning, of purpose, and so forth without just falling into a more common sense view of cognition that is in our lay language and in our cultural history. I wanted something that was more pragmatic and able to be manipulated, changed to create good things. And I ended up in a wing of pragmatism that's so difficult to stay in that even James and Dewey and Peirce and so forth never figured out how to actually keep pragmatists as pragmatists. Every psychologist on the planet wants to trace their history back to James. How is that possible? It's because he wasn't very clear, I think, on how you could possibly do this, and he allowed ontological assumptions to creep in, much to the detriment of. So they were on a slightly different area, but yeah, the ACT work. The only thing I would want listeners to understand from what you said, the core message is very simple. And it now has been shown, I think, by looking at the processes of change in all of psychotherapy, because we've shown through a large meta-analysis that all of the studies for all of the methods on any mental health disorder can be summarized, as a bold claim, in one sentence. Not just ACT. ACT was just one of the more rigorous process, bottom up, do it slowly, figure it out, even down to your philosophical assumptions before stepping forward. I risked my career on it and spent 20 years in with people not knowing about my work and talking to 10 people at a time. And finally stepped forward and talked about the third wave of CBT and in my presidential address and this cognitive behavior therapy group and ACT. Here's the sentence. Life is asking you to learn to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in a meaningful life while scaling that to your relationships and your body. If you allow me to define what open means, what aware means, what engaged in a meaningful life means, and to point to how to scale that to your relationships and your bodies, every single thing we know about how to intervene on these strange creatures called human beings with this infinite capacity crashing into learning systems that are 1,000 times older, and then underlying biological things that are even older than that. life is asking you to learn that. And you see it in our wisdom traditions. You see it in healthy aging. You see it just in anybody you wanted to pick. I could actually prove this to you, Mr. Pick anybody you'd want to pick who profoundly lifts you up. You'll see the core of ACT in your experience. There's other ways to do it, but we have the knowledge implicitly because we're living in the world and the world is teaching us stuff. But the organ between our ears doesn't have the knowledge, and most theory systems go in the wrong direction. Easily. Cognitive therapy, and I love cognitive therapy, went in the direction of, you have to have rational thoughts, not irrational thoughts. And Albert Ellis, crazy old coot who I loved, and he was endorsed even my Relational Frame Theory book. You need to detect, challenge, dispute, and change those irrational cognitions. Boy, be careful with that. You're right on the edge of a cliff. And so, yeah, ACT. So what you said, the part I said, the one thing I worried about, you say, so I just say to myself, what the heck if I get anxious, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but that, for you, if you take somebody who's deeply into a struggle with anxiety, if you're talking about somebody who has a panic disorder, what you just said would be the same as, there's a 50-mile-an-hour wind coming in my face, but I can spit at it. You just try that and see what happens. Spit's coming right back on you, dude. And so not everybody's in the calmer seas. I know if you learned this, Masood, it probably felt like not a calm sea when you learned that method. Yeah, life is indeed asking you to learn how to be open to anxiety and learn from it and carry it with you. Absolutely. And in order to do that, you're going to have to take that mental chatter and move it off to the side, not get rid of it or erase it, but give you a space to learn it. You're going to have to bring your sense of awareness and consciousness, this deeper perspective taking sense of self, maybe even all the way back to this more spiritual sense of self that shows up in psychedelic work or whatever. You're going to have to allocate attention in a flexible, fluid, and voluntary way, because as you start to walk up on stage, it's going to, are you going to turn your head towards it, or are you going to keep your eye focused on the lectern, what you're going to do when you get there? And you better do it as part of a meaningful life and being able to create habits around that, or you'll constantly be having to struggle with it. So, yes, ACT is really cool, and it has inside it a model that I think is, I'll say it, it's the single best model. It does more good for more people in more situations with a small set of concepts. And
Where does the concept of suffering enter? So does suffering has any intrinsic value, or is it something that we create afterwards the event itself to give it a meaning?
I think pain has intrinsic value. Suffering and learning how to dismantle the system that causes real suffering has enormous value, and you'd never learn it without that. Even though you've learned it, you already know it. You know it by experience, but you don't know it at the level that you can deploy it easily on command, and you don't have words for it. In fact, the words fight you. So pain is not optional. Suffering is optional. But suffering is a source of wisdom, and pain is a deep source of wisdom. But what you're doing with suffering is you are trying not to carry a burden of pain, and you're creating pain as a result. And so the most painful thing you can imagine in life, or the most painful thing to do in life, is to really, really, really work hard to not have pain. It'll ruin your life. Or to cling to joy, and the flip side of that. And it's right in the word suffer. The suff part means up and under, fur means ferry, like a ferry boat. And the metaphor is that you have a heavy burden on your back and you're carrying it. Well, what's on your back? Pain's on your back. Why is it such a heavy burden? It's heavy, ironically, because you need to get rid of it. If you got with it, I mean, how heavy is your body? It's pretty heavy. Is it a bird to have a body? No. You're walking around with it. Well, wait a minute. These emotions you have are in you. They're in your emotion, they're in your body. Those thoughts you have are in you. How did they get to be a burden on your back? What was
Mm.
the magic trick that made that happen? People will say, like, it's bigger than I am. It's in you. It can't be bigger than you as a physical being. It's part of you. It's not heavy. Walk
So
around.
it's inseparable. So suffering is in that sense inseparable part of life because it's part of you.
Pain is inseparable. Suffering is optional. It's not a heavy burden. You can put that, okay, let me say it this way. If you were carrying a really heavy sack and it turned out you could inhale it, what would happen to the heavy sack? So you get with your pain. I don't want to say this dismissively because people have been raped. People have seen horrible things. But look, can I just, I'm not, let me cite just a little bit of data really, really quickly. One of the most wonderful studies out there took Syrian uh, uh, refugees who had made it to Turkey. And sometimes people who had, you know, seen their children drown on the way and things like that. Just horrible, horrible, horrible thing. Victims of war. And the World Health Organization did this, and they used a method called Self-Help Plus. Self-Help Plus was ACT. And Mark Van Omeren, who was the mental health director of WHO, came to me 10 years ago and said, when people are the victims of war, everything awful happens. And it's not just so-called, he didn't say so-called, I was here, so-called mental disorders. It isn't just depression, put it in scare quotes, anxiety disorders, put it, no, everything. Your relationships fall apart. You can't sleep, everything. What can we do? And I said, you need to give people psychological flexibility skills. And he said, will you help us? I said, yeah. And my suggestion is go to Russ Harris. He's a much better popularizer. I mean, I originated ACT, but I'm a geek. And Russ is much better at it. He wrote a little book called Doing What Matters in Times of Stress. You can get it for free on the WHO website. It's the single most downloaded book on the WHO website. And that plus some little bit of training and audio tapes with Syrian refugees literally sitting in dirt in circles. 6 months later, these were people who had not yet developed a mental health disorder, 50% reduction with a really well done study. Akra Turk is the senior author of that article, published in World Psychiatry, the highest impact psychiatry journal in the world. Said and he's right, this is the first demonstration we've ever had that we can take people who are very likely to develop mental health disorders, refugees and so forth, and prevent them. So look, the reason I made that quote is life is asking you to learn the sentence I just said. Learn to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in a meaningful life while scaling that to your relationships in your body. And you'll eventually get to it by trial and error. You already kind of know it, but you can do it a lot faster. And it's a lot cooler to learn these kinds of things when you're 20 and 30 and not when you're 60, 70, or 80.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting result. So, okay, as we record this, we are approaching the Valentine's Day. So, I think I saw this in your email signature that I found it really interesting. So, love isn't the everything; it is the only thing. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think when you treat yourself with self-kindness, when your own emotions are allowed to be valid, not literally true with a capital T. I don't believe in capital T truth. I mean, my wing of philosophy, functional contextualism, is an ontological wing. Avoid taking that step of not only is it helpful, but it's helpful because, and then you tell a story and then you can't get outside the story. Well, when you treat yourself in this way that is open, aware, and allows active engagement, you're doing something that feels loving to you. When you do it to other people, it feels loving to them. The kind of love we're talking about is not necessarily hearts and flowers romantic love, but it definitely is this more eudaimonic, your life is valued, valid, you matter kind, which as the little tiny speck on this little tiny speck, uh, when I said more than molecules in the universe, the known universe just expanded, because of when they looked in the spot that had nothing. And it turns out that, oh my God, so who knows, even that on this little speck on a speck on a speck on a speck, in this little life called yours, uh, learning how to embody these processes, the single biggest, easiest word I can come to is love. And I took, of course, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing acronym and flipped it. Apparently, I was the first person to do that because I can't find it on the internet, but I signed it everywhere, and it's probably going to be on my tombstone. And I believe it. Love isn't everything, it's the only thing. And it's such ancient wisdom that it's a hackneyed idea. Love makes the world go round. Bob Dylan songs. It's such a love and only love.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
even if you are like a cold rationalist, let's say, and you are only concerned about objective facts about the world and not any subjective experience, then the question arises: okay, why do you value, let's say, objectivism, science, truth itself? Or maybe do you love truth, science more than anything else? Okay, then we have the love there anyway. So
I think science is the most progressive cultural practice we've ever invented. It's a dangerous force. People lose faith and so forth very quickly. I'm not a person of faith, but I look at the value of faith and I say yes. And I look at what happens when you stand with yourself as being a whole, valid person. And that stance, I think science itself, I just said, if I did a meta analysis of all the properly done studies on every method known in every language we could find, took us 3 years to do that study, looking at it. You can put every single known mediator, a pathway to change, scientifically established and replicated, and fit it into the sentence. Learn how to be more open, aware, actively engaged in a meaningful life while scaling that to relationships in your body. Well, that's a loving stance on yourself, on humanity, on others. And I can show it. I mean, over and over again, I'll give you an example. People have been subjected to completely unfair discrimination and things of that kind. For example, because of their race and things like that. I mean, I have an African American daughter, a Hispanic son, and so forth. I've seen these things directly in my own home. You know that acceptance, the way we define it, is one of the biggest prophylactic to the terrible things that can happen when you're subjected to unfair things for whatever reason, your sexual orientation, your appearance, whatever. And you know what the core of that acceptance thing is? It isn't, oh, you should just accept it. No, 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 you should not accept that situation. But what it means is, and it's right in English, when you give something precious to somebody like your grandmother's ring to your bride to be, and you say, here, will you accept this? Life is giving you a precious gift of emotion, memories, and says, because it's a source of wisdom. And what happens, I think, in this example, which I wanted to use because it's one of the ones where people have been subjected to some of the most unloving things that could happen. Taking the stance that your emotions are valid, like your anger when you've been treated uh, differently because of the color of your skin, is a powerful prophylactic against the psychological sequela to that kind of treatment. You're doing something loving for yourself. You're standing with yourself. If you had a good friend standing with you, they'd say, yeah, that pisses me off just to hear it. With me on that?
So
So
when we say emotional control, we don't necessarily mean suppressing those emotions, but
exactly,
managing it, recognizing them, managing them, and maybe channeling them in a productive way.
exactly. Can you channel the pain and suffering you've had, for example? That was that earlier question. The answer is yes. And so I if you wanted to, I actually challenged my students long ago before I came up with that thing that's on the bottom of my emails. And I said, I want you to summarize all the work that we've done. This was back before we were well known, uh, with one word. And they came up with love. And I thought it was so cool. I challenged them to come up with a single letter, and they came up with the letter B. So that you could do that too, but it sounds a little bit too passive, I think. Love is
But
an
why
active
B? What's
emotion.
the story behind?
Well, just being,
Oh, yeah, yeah. Sorry, I missed that. But yeah, of
if you
course,
just
B.
step into a state of just being who you are here in the present, that has all of these features that I just talked about. So
Especially when you're in the so-called flow state, when you are in conversation with
yeah,
someone. Let's say we are having a podcast where I'm not worried about, okay, what I'm gonna say next, but I'm just participating in it. Okay, let me see what's going to happen, and I will just adjust and do my best in that process. Because at the same time we're discussing, we are constructing or identifying or discovering truth together, rather than being worried about emotions or thoughts.
absolutely. And, going into the flow, the doors into that include letting go. You try to hold on to your worry about how the podcast is going or whether or not I'm being a good guest. And let's see if we will dance together in a way that flow would be a characteristic of it. And the answer would be no. But there's a potential here that you and I have that could happen if we're willing to let go and just be here. And so these things that I'm pointing to are doorways into things that philosophers have talked about and sages have experienced and that we aspire to naturally. We yearn to feel, we learn to belong, we learn to understand. These basic yearnings are right inside the processes I'm talking about of emotional cognitive openness or attentional flexibility from a deeper, more spiritual sense of self or values and creating habits around them. All those fit with deep human yearnings. And if we go into that more loving state, however you want to language about it, from whatever theory, from whatever, not just science, not just therapy, no, from philosophy, from the great art and literature, human beings have been trying to learn how to be human ever since we climbed on the back of that tiger called human language and cognition. And these social primates have a lot of sources of wisdom that are there. They're just a fraction away. You feel like you're in a cage that's made of paper, but it feels like, oh, I'll never get out. Yeah, because you need to get in. So you can almost weep at how much suffering is in the world. Of course, how much pain is in the world needlessly, but then some pain isn't built in. You're going to die. That's painful. Your friends are going to die. That's painful. You'll get sick. That's painful. You'll have injuries. That's painful. You'll be betrayed by other people. That's painful. Okay, how can I learn to carry that with me, in me, so that flow state can even occur?
But
If
that
I
would be
could do a
quite
little
boring.
tiny commercial on this thing I said with psychotherapy, learn how to be open, aware, and active. There's about 1,450 randomized trials on that now, second only to mainstream CBT. and we're part of CBT, but we're quite productive. There's a new one every 3 days. 20 years ago, when I said we'd arrived after 20 years of work, there was only 4 and only 2 had been published. Something like 80% of those are on your physical health, diet, sleep, exercise, dealing with physical disease. And then a similar amount on social justice, wellness, being a good athlete, being a good podcast organizer. Look, these processes that we're talking about, here's my point being, if you're interested in performance, or you're interested in relationships, or you're interested in really, being creative, or help yourself out by getting out of your own way. Learn to be more fully you. There are things you can do to do that. You don't have to wait. You can start now. And you don't have to be in therapy necessarily. And you don't necessarily have to, you can read books, you can go to websites, and you don't have to spend any money. I didn't mention the single most downloaded book.
Yeah,
Doing What Matters in Times of Stress. Go to the WHO website. It's free.
there's no excuse because it's all in online, so you
It's
can
everywhere.
everything.
It's everywhere. And it's in your podcast and the wise people you're having coming on. So
Yeah.
let's get about the business of supporting each other.
I really like the way you described the thought, how they emerge. Okay, I have one final question for you. So, if you could name few philosophers or schools of thoughts or thinkers that have influenced your worldview the most, it would be interesting to know.
Well, the philosopher that's impacted me the most is Stephen C. Pepper in his book World Hypotheses, because it helped make sense. I was a philosophy minor in college and so forth. And it, I could see the importance of grappling with these big questions. But the psychological philosopher that influenced me most is B.F. Skinner in Radical Behaviorism. Tremendously misunderstood. Just so grotesquely misunderstood, in my opinion. You almost need a guide to walk with you. He uses a voice where he'll say things that he's criticizing, and it looks like he's saying it as if he believes it. He named it horribly, radical behaviorism. Are you kidding me? Push, pull, click, mechanistic, Watson, thinking is muscle movements in your larynx, squirts and jerks. Why did you name it that? It should have been called radical contextualism or radical pragmatism or something. What he meant by radical is that you had to take those principles you're applying to living creatures and apply it to yourself as a scientist. And at the moment you do that, all of the Watsonian prohibitions disappear. Everything goes cattywampus because you're languaging about languaging. And that's, if you stick with it, especially if you come out of this pragmatic wing, which after all is an offshoot of evolutionary thinking. That's what it is. It's trying to deal with Darwin. What the heck does that mean? That's what James was doing, right? With his minister father and all of that, and religious person and so forth, varieties of religious experience. But he made a huge error, unfortunately. And Pepper makes the same error. And Skinner made the same error sometimes. And I've tried to clean it up in my life with the work on functional contextualism, which would take a little more talk time. If you wanted to do it, we could do it. But, and I can tell you what the error is. The error is if you're going to be a radical pragmatist, if you're going to be an evolutionist and apply it even to yourself, if your theory of meaning fits with evolution itself, you have to include yourself, number one. And you have to state what your goals are publicly and in a way that others can evaluate, number two. James never did that. He applied it to himself, but didn't say what his goals were. So, read the varieties of religious experience, and it gives example after example after example after example, but never says, really, why would that be of importance? Because successful working pragmatism is only with regard to an outcome. In evolutionary thinking, before we get into the multi-level, multi-dimensional modern evolutionary synthesis, when we're looking at the traditional one, it was just life and death, which is way too restricted. Dawkins and the rest, I think, we are not part of the life cycle of genes. No, come on. You're missing so much of
Mm,
the human being when you do that. We can set our own selection criteria, our values, for example, what's meaningful to us, for example. And we're seeing this in the basic work we're doing on cognition. Well, okay, so back to the point. The point being, if you want to use that, then, dear pragmatist, stand up and say what you have as your goal. Skinner kind of did it. He said prediction and control, but then he said, are the purposes of science. Well, that's dogmatic nonsense. There's all kinds of scientists who don't have that goal. What arrogant son of a, and he was a little bit. I do him well. I spent a lot of time with Fred, a wonderful scientist, in my opinion. But instead, you stay up and say, my purposes are prediction and influence. That's I like influence better than control, because control has too much, they didn't mean it. And I want to do it with precision and scope and depth. I want a unified fabric of science that fits with our wisdom traditions, our literature, and so forth, that amplifies the best and that is profoundly useful. So I'm back to, the pragmatic philosophers, Peirce and Dewey and all, and modern ones, but I don't see enough attention to the things that, if you want to then intervene and change things, which I do, then you better be really careful about publicly stating your goals, allowing people to vote with their feet. Because otherwise, pragmatism, it was hardly out of the words of James before capitalism said what's good for GM is good for the country.
mhm.
They loved pragmatism because it justified any kind of capitalistic thing you wanted to do. And that was total nonsense. It's not true. What's good for GM is good for the country. What do you mean by good? Tell me what the goal is, dude. If you mean that you're going to have a really big business and make a lot of money, okay, but declare that publicly. The purpose of my philosophy is for me to have a lot of money and to control. Okay. And we'll see how many people
And
vote with their feet and applaud. And
and the
so,
definition, the whole, the whole definition of philosophy is not really about, shouldn't be about like making money, like, yeah, that this the whole question disappears when we have that premise.
I think philosophy, at least philosophy of sciences, is the only thing I've really spent much time with, even though I was a philosophy minor, is just owning your assumptions and examining their coherence and working to have them fit with your scientific purposes. And philosophy is embedded in every knowledge system because you have assumptions. We're back to assumptions are part of any complex symbolic system. You have to start outside the system to create the system. Okay, well, say what your assumptions are, declare them publicly, and that includes what your purposes are, and then let's rock and roll. And that's exactly what the textual behavioral science is the name for the wing that
Well,
pays
the
back. That's what
philosophy used to
Backfires is about.
mean. I think these days philosophy gets a bad reputation, but it used to just mean pursuit of knowledge up
Yes.
until very recently, and that's just what we do in the science as well. So method might be different, empirical or metaphysical claims, but it's just a pursuit of knowledge. There is nothing really spooky about philosophy.
Yeah, thus you get a PhD, and they get a PhD for a pretty good reason. And I do think that philosophical work in particular areas requires some additional clarity. And philosophy of science is a particular way of knowing. It's not the only way of knowing. You can know by direct experience, you can know, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a special one and a culturally progressive one. And the reason, I teetered on back in high school when I decided to be a psychologist, I said, I really love art and literature and all that kind of stuff, but I really love science. And I'm interested in Maslow and peak experiences and all this. Well, what should I be? I think I'll be a psychologist because it's the one field I could think of where you could do that whole thing, and at its best, I think that's true. Um, so you're right, I think, about philosophy writ large, and we're doing it right now just in our lay culture. But I think if you want science to inform that, look at the philosophy of science of the sciences, scientists and science areas that you embrace. Because if their assumptions are different than your assumptions, their knowledge, which is only part of the whole knowledge, that Venn diagram isn't going to overlap as well with what you really want to know. So if you really want to explore philosophy writ large in order to inform, for example, a meaningful life as a human being, you better make sure that your philosophy of science affords the exploration of things like meaning and purpose in a way that fits with what you're doing. And, this is kind of a train wreck when you try to, for example, people will, let's say, I'll give you a quick example. I know, uh, let's say your philosophical view is that you have to have a name for everything and have it all fit together, what Pepper calls formism, Plato, things like that. Okay, that's far. And in the development of philosophy, after you've let go of, some of the, mysticism, which doesn't seem to be very good in terms of its precision, or animism, which isn't very good in terms of its scope and precision. It's one of the first ones because it's built right into our common sense understanding of language. Just having names for things. It's a philosophy of naming. What is this? Okay. There's a lot of it out there. Let's say personality theory. And then you say, I want to live a good life. And here's what you're reading. And now it's like, oh, am I this personality or am I that personality? Well, I can walk you through the science of that and show it even mathematically. It is a profound misdirection of anything that could apply to you. Big five personality only appears when you're looking at the aggregate using statistics that are based on Galton forward. And it violates a thing called ergodicity, which is a requirement for aggregates to apply to the particular. You're a particular. So we're swimming in a stream of science that doesn't fit our purposes in what we want. A lot of what we want is behavioral science. We want the kind of science that informs what it's like to be human. We want anthropology, sociology, psychology, neurobiology, etc., to inform it. And we're adopting conceptual systems that can't do it because they're based on knowledge development systems that are fundamentally flawed in their assumptions applying to us. Within their own assumptions, they're fine. If you really want to find consistencies in an aggregate, no matter what you do on personality, you'll find 5. If you follow every human being on the planet and look one at a time, it totally disappears. And I maybe I shouldn't be saying things like that I can't unpack without a lot of talk, but there is a way. I think most people are interested in philosophy because they're intuitive pragmatists. They want something that works for them. And
Yeah, especially when we talk about specifically moral philosophy, ethics. Yeah, I mean, we have seen that especially Stoicism has been on the rise. We have
yeah,
like everyone talking about Stoicism. So the way I see it is that so there is this meaning crisis that everyone is talking about, and
yeah,
in the presence of that, then we have now returned to this philosophy as a way of life, as a wisdom as a way of life, thinking.
right.
So we get rid of all the mystical elements out of, let's say, Stoicism, but then we keep the ethical part of it. Yeah, control what you can. This is the way, like wisdom and so on. So especially like ethics, moral philosophy, I think is becoming more relevant.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, and the people that we meant I mentioned, pragmatic philosophers, have struggled with that a little bit, because if you don't have a goal, if you're not clear on that, you're pretty close to Machiavellian anything goes. You know, if you start thinking about meaning is use, and use is what the consequences are, and yeah, but then that means abusing women is a true thing to do or something. I mean, you can get into crazy spaces with that if you don't get clear. So I think figuring out how to create a moral, ethical position as a pragmatist is essential, and I think there is a, a good way to do it. And I've written some about it and talked about some about it, but it's a journey we need to go through. We're in an era right now where the pragmatic impact of our science is going like this, and we're about to hit, in the singularity where we're at the edge of, where we don't even know how to predict the future because it's so different. But we can predict one thing: that human beings are going to be challenged by that uh, acceleration of knowledge. We already see it in people drawing in, and the authoritarianism and so forth. When people get afraid, that's what happens. We've seen that over and over culturally, and you can feel it psychologically. Um, so yeah, but I think there is a way around it, which is to own your purposes, declare them publicly, hold yourself accountable to them. What is that? Well, that's a values journey. What are your values? And the whole of you makes that choice. If you put that into science, it's perfectly fair, I think, to say to scientists, what are your values? What are your goals? What are your purposes? And then hold them to account to actually meeting that. And maybe that gives us a way forward in the cultural upheaval we're about to experience.
Cultural plus, yeah, technological. Okay, that it has been great talking to you so far. What are you working on these days? Where should people go to check out your recent work? Are you writing a new book, or do you have
I
any website?
I have a website, stevenchayes.com and so forth, and I have blogs and occasional um, interviews and things like that, and you can easily find those there. And I have a large trade book that I'm working on, which is trying to summarize. Which working title is Open, Aware, and Active. Open, Aware, and Engaged, which is summarizing this. But what I'm actually working on is correcting 150 years of scientific lies that have come out of the failure to appreciate that Galton's biostatistics, which was driven by an interest in eugenics, everybody knows it, nobody writes about it, fundamentally is mathematically flawed, and because it violates ergodicity, which every physics major knows about, which is basically you can't go from a collection of an aggregate to the prediction of over time of the elements of the aggregate unless all of the elements follow the same dynamic model and there are no trends. So if you're interested in frozen clones, you should be interested in the psychology, because 95% of our research is built on Galton's edifice and is trying to apply to the particular. Based on all of this, here's what you should do. Well, that's going from an aggregate to particular. Well, how can we do it instead? We had to invent words for it. We invented a word called idionomics. Take the trajectory of individuals and model them one person at a time without any information being shared between people, then look for patterns, then develop monomothetic laws. And we've gotten it so wrong that at kitchen table conversations, people are saying things like, oh, my son was put into special ed, and the other person says, my son gifted and talented, as if that predicts their future. Masood, it doesn't.
Yep.
It violates the mathematics. Go on Grok. Go on and say, here's the word, ergodic, ERGODIC. Anyone listening, go there and say, I read this study using an aggregate statistical model, means and standard deviations, and it had this finding. If I apply that to myself, am I violating ergodicity? And all the AI systems will say yes. Friends, this is what it means. Every AI system out there now knows what only like 1/10 of 1% of the psychologists know, which is that their methods don't apply to individual, particular people, couples, or families. So you're reading it and trying to apply it. No. What you need, and I come out of behavior analysis that was one organism at a time. 3 animals intensively studied. There's a few areas in developmental neuro that have things like that. But I'm not trying to sing a song that the behaviorists are right. I'm just saying we got sucked into a racist, anti-Semitic driven model of reality and science linked to it. And it became so thoroughly embedded that even though in psychology, for example, 2/3 of the presidents of APA, American Psychological Association, from 1892 to 1947 were card-carrying eugenicists, you can hardly find it in the intro text. The word ergodicity doesn't appear in any psychology intro text I can find. And no one has noticed and talked about these big chapters on the scientific method that worshiped, bell curve, standard deviations. Pearson's R, and Carl Pearson was a eugenicist. Fisher's Z on your chi-squared. R.A. Fisher was a eugenicist. They developed the knowledge. They gave us concepts that have so changed our cultural way of thinking that we can't think outside the box. And it's a tragedy. And
Yeah,
that's what I'm working on the most right now.
even if something has been recognized as not valid, like the effect is still visible because of the long history
It's
behind
already
it.
there. If I could nominate one evil one, that if you said what I'm doing, I want to kill the DSM. Because the DSM is all these kind of analytic categories based on these aggregate statistics that don't, and people know it's something wrong. All the young kids, I don't want to say I'm abnormal. And they come in with 10 different diagnoses. I have this and I have this and I have this and I have this. That's not individuality. You need to think in a different way and break out of these categorical schemes that were driven by scientific assumptions that have been that led to analytic tools. So that's what I'm working on. It's a pretty big area, and it is a little shocking how extreme it takes me, or how extreme it makes me sound. But I ain't the only one, as John Lennon said, and we'll see how it happens, how it unfolds. I think there's a potential for us to create a form of science that allows us to be pragmatically useful, philosophically consistent, and to be able to, even as individuals and consumers, sort of do science on yourself in a way that's more idiographic and personalized and particular to you, but that isn't just anything goes, that is really allows a progressive, nomothetic general laws that allow general laws to emerge. But we're going to have to tear down some houses to make it happen, because what has been built over the last 150 years is lying to scientists themselves and to the consumers of science, behavioral science especially.
Steven, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you today. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for allowing me to be on your program. And I hope I've been useful.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, please follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Please also consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the show reach a lot of people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episode. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the following weeks, and following the show is the best way to be notified about them. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can DM me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.